This right here is the Stug, the literal worst weapon in the history of Warframe. A gun so comically bad that it turned into an all-time community meme. So, naturally, when the developers announced that it would receive an Incarnon update, we were all understandably very excited. And it is very freaking strong. And it has a bunch of problems too. So in this video, I'm gonna give you a full breakdown of all you have to know so you know exactly how to get the most ridiculous damage out of it and how most definitely not to. Big shout out to all our generous channel members, and now let's check it out. But first things first, let's quickly go over the basics and how the Incarnon mode works. The Stug is a secondary weapon that works pretty simple. You shoot out little blobs of corrosive goop that stick to surfaces as well as enemies. If you keep shooting on the same blob of goop, then you make it bigger over time, and after a little bit these goop blobs explode, dealing a bit of AoE damage. However though, let's now talk about the elephant in the room, and that would be the Incarnon mode. In order to charge it up, all you gotta do is hit direct body shots, similar to, for example, the turret Incarnon. You can then go and transform the Stug into its Incarnon mode, in which the weapon starts working a little bit differently. At base, you're still shooting out these goop blobs, but now they have an additional feature where if they explode, they spawn even more small goop blobs that will bounce around in the area a little bit and then after some time explode themselves to deal a bit of AoE damage. By default, without any multi-shot, one blob from the Stug will create two little goop pellets, let's call them that, and if you have more multi-shot, then you are gonna get more pellets out of it. However, this leads us to the first little weird mechanic or issue, I might say, because multi-shot on the Stug just works very, very weirdly. Take a look at this. On basically every Incarnon weapon, and according to the wiki, also on the Stug, the more multi-shot you have, the more shots contribute to charging the Incarnon meter, aka more multi-shot means faster charge rate. However, if we compare the Stug at base versus the Stug with plus 120% multi-shot, aka twice the pellets, then what we notice is that there is barely any difference in Incarnon charge. Yeah, turns out that for the Stug, plus 100% multi-shot just does not mean you get double the pellets. You just get a teensy tiny little bit more, maybe, and unfortunately for the Incarnon form, this trend continues. On the one hand, we're gonna get 2 goop pellets if we don't have any additional multi-shot. On the other side now, I have a fully charged galvanized diffusion plus lethal torrent, aka it should basically have 4 times the pellets. However, what it does in reality is you get 4 instead of 2, not 8. So yeah, I don't know exactly how the multi-shot values transfer into the goop pellet amount. However, at this point in time, to me it seems like if you just half your multi-shot value, then you roughly end up at what you're seeing on screen. Let's also take a quick look at the stats, and here I really only want to go over the Incarnon form because the stats of the normal fire don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. In its Incarnon form, the Stug has 15% crit chance and a 2x multiplier at base. This is nothing crazy, but there are options that we're going to discuss in just a minute how to make it much better. However, what's very, very weird is that by default in Incarnon form, the status chance of the Stug is just 0%. At least that's what it says in the stats. Weirdly enough though, when I played with the Stug in this form, it did still trigger some occasional status effects like you also see in the background, so I don't really know what this 0% status chance really means. The biggest kicker here though is the AoE range of the explosion of those little goop pellets. Because this one, which is already very low at 0.3 meters in the normal form, in the Incarnon form, it also only sits at 0.45 meters by default. So, in other words, as long as you don't sniff those goop pellets through your nose, you're basically not going to be hit by the AoE. This is the single most limiting factor of the Stug Incarnon. Yes, if you have high enemy density and a small room, it doesn't really matter all that much because the goop pellets are going to hit the enemies directly anyway, but once you have a bit of a larger room with some more space, you will realize that your damage output significantly goes down. However though, don't worry, we're gonna have a fix for that later. And as always, if you could leave a quick like for the video, that'd be really nice because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. So cheers so much for your support. So yeah, now that we all know how the basics of the Stug work, let's take a look at the Incarnon Evolutions, very important for any Incarnon weapon. Evolution 1 just triggers Incarnon form, so that doesn't matter. Evolution 2, however, that is already very interesting. We have two options right here. One increases our base damage by 175, and it gives us up to 50% more multi-shot. However, the other one, Overcharge Blast, gives us 300% more base damage, and if we have more than 700 maximum energy, we get 50% more blast range. Now, if you ask me, then Overcharge Blast is objectively the right choice here. As we previously established, multi-shot on the Stug kinda sorta doesn't really do all too much, so those plus 50% multi-shot is really not gonna make any meaningful difference, and I'm not gonna sacrifice so much extra damage just for that extra bit of multi-shot. As for the other evolution, yeah, the 50% blast range is also kinda bad, because with such a low initial blast range, we're also not really gonna feel that either, but at least plus 300% base damage is much better than plus 175. Evolution number 2 then comes down to personal preference. This one is just, overall convenience. We have either plus 50% reload speed, we have plus 50% projectile speed, or on reload from empty, we increase our magazine capacity by 10. If you ask me, I personally prefer the 50% reload speed because, unfortunately, with the Stug, one full magazine in the normal form will not be enough to fully charge your Incarnon meter. That means you always have to go through at least one reload before you're back in Incarnon form. And with this 50% reload speed, it just makes it much more convenient. As for the projectile speed, I could totally understand why you would want to go for it because those corrosive blobs are really darn slow. But then on the other hand, you kinda sorta don't really aim for any target anyway, just spray it all over the ground and let the little goop pellets do their thing. And then lastly, in evolution number 4, this is where it gets really darn interesting. Remember how I initially said that by default the Stug Incarnon has 0% status chance? Well, we can now fix that with Elemental Dominance. This one increases our base status chance by plus 20%, and in Incarnon form, this is doubled. With this evolution right here, you go from 0% status chance on the Incarnon form to a whopping 40. And I should say here, this status chance is considered base status chance, so it doesn't apply after, it applies before any mods. So for example, if we mod plus 100% status chance on it now, we would be at 80% status chance. This is really darn strong. Then, however, we also have the polar opposite with Death Trap Trigger. This one gives us a massive 25% more base crit chance and plus 1.5 times base crit damage multiplier, which, as you can also see right here, sets our status chance back to 0, but therefore we have 40% base crit chance with a 3.5 times crit damage multiplier. This is really strong when it comes to crit performance. And then lastly, you sort of have a jack of all trades, Survivor's Edge, you get 15% of both, so you're now at 15% base status chance and 30% base crit chance with normal crit damage multiplier. If you ask me personally, I think this one isn't really all that great because there are two specific builds that I have in mind, and one really wants to go all into crit, whereas the other one really needs to go all into status. Going for a little bit of both kinda sorta ends you up with the worst side of both scenarios. At base though, for like your overall use case, I would highly recommend going for the status one, not for the crit. The crit can be fixed with something like Secondary Innovate, and we're going to talk about that later in the builds. So if you don't want to go for specific weapon Warframe synergies, then this here is definitely the only right option to go for. But okay, now that we know how the Stug works and which evolutions to pick, let's finally talk about the builds. And before we jump into the modding for the first one, we need to first of all go over how to fix our AoE issue. Remember what we said earlier, the area of effect of your little goop pellets is basically 0 and you might as well ignore it. So, what are we going to do to fix it? Well, first of all, we're definitely not going to go for the evolution that gives us a bit more range, and we're also not going to mod any blast range on the weapon, because both of that scales with the base value, meaning if the base value is as trash as it is, it really doesn't do anything for us. Instead, we just focus on dealing status effects that in and of themselves have an AoE, aka our options here would be blast or gas. Now, On the blast side of things, one blast explosion has a radius of 5 meters, which is already significantly better than the initial value of the Stug itself. As for gas, this one has an initial radius of a 3-meter gas cloud, which further increases with subsequent gas procs, totaling at a maximum of 6 meters. Now, I've tested builds with both blast as well as gas, and what I can say is that gas is for sure the better way to go. Blast as a status effect can be really strong, but you need to have a ton of blast application. And with the nature of these little blobs, that's just really not happening all that much. You're gonna inflict 1, 2, 3 blast procs on every single enemy, but you're never really getting one up to the maximum of 10, where the real strength of blast lies. However, with gas though, you create gas clouds all over the place, even on single gas procs alone, which are gonna deal significant damage over time and are very, very good at clearing large areas of the map in literal split seconds. So yeah, long story short, I've tried direct damage builds, I've tried blast builds, and I've tried gas builds, and from all my testing, what I can say is that the gas builds have always significantly outperformed anything else. So I feel quite comfortable saying that gas is literally the best way to build the Stug Incarnon. But yeah, let's take a look at what I cooked up here. What you're seeing right here is a standard status build. For this build, I of course used the evolution that gives me the 40% base status chance in Incarnon mode, which, as you can see clearly right here, gives me 120% status chance, even more once I trigger Galvanized Shot often enough, but it gives us a lot of status chance is what I'm trying to say, and of course we're going for gas. So let's go over the mods here. First of all, in the Arcane we use Secondary Enervate. This one is really great because it increases our crit chance incrementally by a flat amount of 10%. This means with subsequent hits, we're gonna get yellow crits, we're gonna get orange, we're even gonna see red crits in the long run, even though our base crit chance is really darn low. That is the perfect Arcane, and also the reason why the other evolution, where we get a little bit of both, why this is not really all that good, because through Secondary Innovate, we can go for maximum status and still have all the crit in the world without compromise. We then add base damage with Hornet Strike, and because we're having a gas build, that means we of course mod for gas, but we also go for a faction damage mod as well as an elementalist, due to the fact that gas is considered damage over time. With these two, you're gonna get really ridiculous damage out of your gas clouds. In order to get more little goop pellets, I went for Galvanized Diffusion for the multi-shot. Yes, multi-shot doesn't really do a lot, but it still does something, and with a maxed out Galvanized Diffusion, we're at least spawning 4-ish pellets per shot and not just 2. Galvanized Shot for even more status chance, but if you ask me, you might as well replace this with something else if you have other preferences, because the second perk, the direct damage per status type, that really only works on direct hit, so you're not gonna get the full effect out of this as compared to other weapons. This build then is what I would also personally recommend if you don't have any specific Warframe synergy to work with, because it just works decent enough on basically any setup. However, if you're not really into dealing a lot of gas clouds and then let them slowly trickle the enemy down over time, I have another build prepared for you, which is a specific synergy with Saren right here, and that is a more direct damage focused build, where your little goop pellets, you try to hit the enemies directly with them so they deal the maximum damage. For this build, I switched the 4th evolution into the one that gives us absolute maximum crit performance. And yes, that means we're now having officially 0% status chance. However, it's a direct crit damage build, so we're not really focusing on that here either. As for the build itself, this right here is what we're working with. For the elements, I went just for corrosive, whatever you want to go for. If you go against Corpus, if you're going to go against Infested, you're of course going to switch the element accordingly. As for the rest of the build, we focus a whole bunch on more crit. Go for Prime Target Cracker, of course, for more crit damage, Prime Pistol Gambit for even more crit chance, and I went even further into crit with Secondary Outburst that allows me to get plus 220% more crit chance and more crit damage on top. This is absolute peak crit performance. As for the rest of the build, it just focuses on dealing as much flat damage as possible, as you can also see right here. 10,000 damage on a Stug is pretty healthy. However though, The fact that we only have 0% status chance does sting quite a bit, so what I thought is, why don't we just use it with the weapon buffer number 1, and that would be Saren. This right here is the Saren build that we're currently working with here, and it's just an elemental roar damage buffing build. I'm not going to explain every single mod here, just that we're using roar as a subsume for more faction damage, which is always good. We use Spores with the Venom Dose Augment to give even more corrosive damage to our Stug, and then we also use Toxic Lash because Toxic Lash gives us a second damage instance for every hit that we deal that always forces toxin damage. This way, we're gonna get a whole bunch of DOTs even though we're not having any status chance at all. In addition to that, we get even more crit chance from Arcane Avenger, although with this build it's probably the smarter way to go for Arcane Hotshot and trigger that with Diriga, as well as Arcane Velocity because having more fire rate is really great on the Stug. This way, it's a ton of fun to play, but I gotta say, of course, it benefits a whole bunch from Saren and not all that much from the Stug itself. But now, last and definitely not least, I want to show you the, in my opinion, most broken interaction with the new Stug Incarnon. And for this one, we're gonna have another Warframe synergy, this time with Lavos. Also here, this right here is the Lavos build that I'm using. It's absolutely nothing special, just a healthy all-round build where I don't need to worry about survivability all that much. But of course also here, we use Roar because it is a very nice damage boost. Now, the reason why Lavos is so incredibly good with the Stug is that he has this beautiful augment right here, Valence Formation, which allows us to infuse any of the elements that we cook up with Lavos onto our weapon in a way that it triggers guaranteed status effects. Guaranteed status effects on every hit. What this allows us to do is to use a build like this where we're not modding for gas because we're going to be adding the gas through Lavos. This way, we always have a guaranteed gas proc on every single hit ever, while at the same time opening up more build space for the rest here. And that is a very strong combination. Also here, it is a status build where we go for damage over time with an Elementalist mod and faction damage, because that is the way you get the most damage out of your gas. We have base damage, we have multi-shot, we have a bit of fire rate and even more multi-shot in the form of Lethal Torrent, as well as decent crit chance and crit damage. Also here, what we do is, because we get guaranteed status effects from Lavos, that means we don't need status chance on our Stug. And that is why also here, we're gonna go for the maximum crit performance. This then allows us to get some ridiculous numbers out of these two mods plus the Arcane, and that is, I promise you, it is very strong, and you gotta try this combination. In my opinion, the strongest thing you can do on the Stug. By the way, I also thought about maybe going for Cyto 9 because Cyto 9 has the elemental ammo, which also works the same way as Lavos' skill. But then I remembered that the Stug is an Incarnon weapon and that the elemental ammo from Cyto 9 just doesn't work on all the Incarnon weapons, so really Lavos is the only candidate here. Lastly, to trigger my little secondary outburst arcane here that gives me all the crit and all the crit damage in the world, what I use as a melee weapon is the Dex Nakana. The Dex Nakana, I already made multiple videos on this on the channel, is a great stat stick for these types of arcanes because it increases its combo multiplier very quickly, and with a build, something like this here for example, you will be able to basically be at a constant 11x on the Dex Nakana all the time, which allows you to just, swap between the melee and the pistol once every 30 seconds, and therefore constantly keep secondary outburst up. It's very convenient. And now, also check out my full guide on the brand new Warframe, Sirius and Orion right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nost Linux Gaming, Turtle Pier, Undercanio 2, Scalabauza, Mihawki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Shadow Lockhart, Han Tagas, Patrisator, Brumia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin 8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, Candy Fox 19, Argentat, GE Schnoz, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, have a great start into the week.